Okay, I think that's everybody who is in the waiting room who has joined. Welcome everybody. It's great to have you with us. Welcome to this expert masterclass. I'm Dave Cullen, as I'm sure many of you know, the program manager for the Emerging Voices Network. Uh, First of all, at the top, I should say that this masterclass is being recorded. The only the speaker, people speaking will be recorded, but just be aware if you want to ask a question, you're very welcome to do so using the video, but you will be on the recording if you do, or if you prefer, you can submit a question in the chat. Okay, with no further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Lyndon Burford, who is a policy fellow in the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Programme here at BASIC, and also the project manager of the Nuclear Transparency Index, or NUTRI, which will be a major focus of his talk today. Lyndon's research focuses on the relationships between nuclear politics and multilateral treaties, nuclear weapons postures and practices, and emerging and/or disruptive technologies like AI. He is a constructive advanced thinking fellow with the European Network of Institutes for Advanced Studies. And before BASIC, amongst many other things, Lyndon was a consultant to the Future Safe programme of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, a research associate with the Horizon 2045 initiative, and served as an advisor on the delegation of Terra New Zealand to the 9th NPT Review Conference in 2015. The format, again, as I'm sure many of you know, is that he will talk for about half an hour and then there'll be a chance for Q&A. If you think of a question while he's talking, feel free to type it in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function and we will come to all the questions at the end. Okay, no further ado, over to you, Lyndon.
Great, thanks so much, Dave. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here, to the EVN team for organising. Let me just share my screen and make sure that the setup is all good. So, have you got my slides correctly there? Great.
We do.
Kiara nodding, thank you. Excuse me. So yeah, thanks very much for being here. It's great to have you all. And let me just start with a couple of introductory remarks for you guys in the network.
Sorry to cut you off, Lyndon. I think you're sharing both your slides and your notes.
Gotcha. So I'm effectively
Okay,
sharing.
all good now.
Okay. Apologies. Let me back up and change my sharing settings because I would rather not be sharing my entire desktop. I'm obviously sharing the wrong tab. This is what I want to be sharing. Okay, great. If I do this, can you not see my...
We cannot. All good.
Great, because it's all top secret in the transparency inventory. Yeah, so just to say, I really appreciate and encourage all of the work that you guys are doing in the EVN network. As someone that's kind of working parallel with what you guys are doing with the basic EVN team, but also the network more broadly, I just want to say that I personally find it really encouraging and quite inspiring, and I really encourage you to keep engaging. And I'm currently working on a couple of bits and pieces with people that I've met many years ago in my own kind of version of the EVN network, and what I would say is that the dynamics, the partnerships, the relationships that I've built there have stayed with me for many years. So what you're doing is really valuable, and I just encourage you to take every opportunity you can. The feedback that I had from the most recent EVN event in Istanbul was also really exciting. So the EVN network's doing some really fantastic collaborations with other organizations and also just doing really great work. So congratulations to all of you for being a part of it, and I really encourage you to keep that up. It's a fantastic opportunity. Okay, so on with the Nuclear Transparency Inventory presentation. So thank you very much for your very kind introduction, Dave. I think what I would like to say at the outset is a caveat, which is like, I would definitely not call myself a nuclear transparency expert. That is not how I think of myself. I am a project manager managing a project related to research on nuclear transparency. I certainly hope in future to be able to develop greater expertise, but what I'm going to present to you today is the thinking behind and the initial research outline for BASIC's current project called the Nuclear Transparency Inventory, which is about cataloging the way that different states approach this question of transparency. So yeah, that's my caveat. I don't imagine that I can possibly answer all of the questions that you'll have, but I'll certainly do my best. So with that caveat in place, what I would just start with is just some, where am I? Yes. Just some sort of thoughts to start the process with to get you guys thinking around these questions of transparency. So why might states choose transparency? Well, I would say, broadly speaking, you can think about this from two different directions. One is from a cooperative perspective, and the other is from a more adversarial perspective. So in cooperative terms, of course, transparency is necessary if you're going to attempt to verify agreements. So that includes both non-proliferation agreements like the NPT. So I'm sure many of you will be aware that in the NPT dialogue at the moment, there's this catchphrase of transparency and accountability. So whenever in the NPT context you hear people talking about transparency, you inevitably hear them talking about transparency and accountability. So in that context of a multilateral nuclear treaty, what you see is that the whole concept of transparency is immediately tied in the minds of the practitioners, by which I mean the officials and the diplomats who go along to these meetings. They are explicitly tying the concept of transparency to the concept of accountability. And the idea is that as a multilateral treaty, they have obligations to each other, and they see the treaty serving their security interests broadly in terms of preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, enabling access to peaceful uses of nuclear technology. But the way that they think about that is like, I'm contributing to a transparency process in order to enable accountability under this treaty. So that's one version of kind of cooperative, what I'm calling cooperative, whether the politics of it actually may be a lot more adversarial in practice, but the idea is that we all give a little and we all get a little. A second way of thinking about this is more explicitly in a nuclear arms control context, where it's a much more specific set of things that are being verified, because the example that I just gave from the NPT is also wrapped around, in particular, the idea of disarmament. So the disarmament so-called pillar of the treaty, what NPT states are looking at is mainly the 5 nuclear weapon states that are recognized in that treaty as nuclear weapon states, and their reporting regarding their implementation of nuclear disarmament agreements made in the treaty context. And so the accountability there is about, it's not just about nuclear weapon states, it's about the accountability of nuclear weapon states to the other parties to the treaty, i.e. the non-nuclear weapon states. In the New START example, it's much more of a, obviously it's a bilateral arrangement, and it's really about getting strong visibility on the actual nuclear arsenals and the practices related to those nuclear arsenals. Obviously in the New START context, it's only delivery vehicles with a kind of subsidiary counting process for warheads, but it's about the delivery vehicles. But in that context, what you see is that it's not just transparency and accountability as in the NPT context. What you see is that people are actually, by people, I'm sorry, what I mean is the United States and Russia, at least until recently, were proactively disclosing information about their arsenals to each other. And so in that context, they have this very specific criteria for what data, when, how it's to be presented, how it's to be formatted, all of these kinds of things, how often. And again, so I'm going to call that cooperative, not because these two countries particularly, want to be cooperating with each other, but it's the same. You give a little, you get a little, and it's that you give up a degree of perhaps perceived vulnerability by giving up sensitive information, and what do you get in return is greater visibility around the activities of your potential adversary that enable you to have confidence that they're not doing things that you would rather they are not doing, in this case things that they have explicitly committed to in a treaty. And then the third way that I would look at this is, these are both cases, so the NPT and New START are both cases of transparency being applied after a treaty is in place on the basis of that treaty in order to verify that the parties to the treaty are complying with their commitments. The INF treaty is a slightly different example, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, is a slightly different example in the sense that what you have there is that you have transparency enabling the completion of the treaty. So there's a particular type of verification technology that's called perimeter portal monitoring. And what this is basically a way to scan what is passing in and out of the perimeter of facilities. And so in this case, the INF treaties were ongoing. They stalled for a period, and during the period of several months, I think it was, I can't remember exactly, during that period while the negotiations were stalled, certain people at US national labs kind of looked at the shape of the negotiations and went, do you know what? There's a gap here where we're not reaching agreement, but if we just plugged this particular technology into that gap, it would increase the ability to verify the treaty, and that obviously is a greater sense of transparency. So it's a greater sense of transparency about the particular activities that Russia was engaging in. And so what they did is they sprinted to basically bring that technology to maturity. It was something that they talked about, but they hadn't developed. So the US labs sprinted to bring this particular technology to maturity. It enabled greater transparency on the Russian side in a way that Russia was willing to accept. And the result was that the treaty was completed several months later and became what, to all effects, was arguably the most successful disarmament treaty, nuclear disarmament treaty in history. So there's three ways you can think about transparency in terms of cooperative measures. The final one that I would flag here is when you think about this in adversarial terms, you might think about it in terms of signaling for deterrence purposes. So the example I've put here in brackets is nuclear testing. So there's all this discussion around nuclear testing. So in terms of why states might choose to test nuclear weapons, on one side they could argue that technically they need to test in order to ensure the reliability and performance metrics of the nuclear weapons, although that is certainly less of a convincing argument from the US side, given that the US has done well over 1,000 nuclear tests already. But equally, it sends a signal. It shows that you have both the capability and a willingness to explode nuclear weapons, even if only in a test environment. And so is that a form of transparency? So there is a way of also talking about transparency, which I haven't put on here, but the phrase that sometimes is used is transparency as dialogue. So it's transparency as a way of engaging in dialogue, whether it's with your adversaries or with people that you're trying to be cooperative with. So I'd say that idea applies across both of these potential categories. So there's just a general framing discussion, and what I'll do now is I'll move on to the actual nuclear transparency inventory project and talk a little bit about where that fits into this overall framing and what we are and are not trying to do with this project. So NUTRI, I should say nuclear transparency inventory, internally we call it NUTRI. So if I say NUTRI, what I mean is the nuclear transparency inventory. So what are our goals with this project? So the first is to create a foundation of shared knowledge. So obviously there's a lot of discussion in recent years of the fact that we live in a, quote, post-truth world. We can barely agree on whether it's raining or not sometimes, right? Depending on where we sit on the political spectrum. So there is a fundamental lack of agreement on some really foundational facts. And as a sort of corollary of that, whether it's causally linked, we're just not even talking anymore. So basically all throughout the Cold War, even at the worst of times, there was always dialogue between the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, and the West, NATO/United States. The quality of that dialogue waxed and waned over time, but there was always dialogue. It's not even clear that we have that today. It's possible that there's some back channel discussions going on around a potential, not successor, but some form of, maintaining the implementation of certain limits around the New START treaty. But even that, it's very vague what's going on there. So we're not even talking. And I would say that one of the reasons that this is problematic, or one of the reasons it's contributing to this problem, is that we can't even agree on some foundational facts. So what we're doing with NUTRI is we're trying to say, look, let's just draw a line and say, here is the foundation. This is what states say that they do, right? This is where states are willing to be transparent. What we're aiming to do with that is to create a go-to source of data that people can trust in terms of accurately reflecting the reality of countries' policies and practices. What we're not doing, at this stage at least, is we're not fact-checking that data. So we're not making claims to say that the data that you'll find on NUTRI is 100% factually accurate. What we are saying is, this is what this country tells us about their nuclear arsenals and about their related nuclear practices, policies, and facilities. So the idea of doing that, as I said, is to set this foundation where at least we have a baseline that everyone can agree on because it is the publicly stated policy. And then from there, we aim to support and encourage further research and dialogue around the question of transparency. What is transparency? What is it good for? What does it do in practice? And then finally, on a personal note, but also sort of speaking in terms of the project leader here from the basic side, is to encourage this idea of strategic empathy, which is kind of a fancy word for understanding each other. But basically, the idea of it being, to quote this historian, Zach Shaw, the skill of stepping out of our own heads and into the minds of others. So there is an argument to be made that at the strategic level, there is a lot of strategic narcissism in the practices of the nuclear armed states, and I would personally argue that that exacerbates risks and increases the likelihood of those risks coming to fruition. So you'll note there on that slide that I've sort of bolded the word skill, and that is to emphasize the reason that I think that NUTRI is a useful contribution to the literature generally and to the conversation is because this whole idea of strategic empathy, it's not a capability that you just have or don't have. It's not something you turn on. It's something that you have to practice doing because it doesn't come naturally to us. Certain people are more empathetic than others. Certain countries, you could argue, are more empathetic than other countries. But generally speaking, if you look at the rhetoric around America first, or, sort of the way that Putin talks about Russia, Putin talks about, I think, he said, was it in his 2018 speech, he said, is this risking the end of the world? Certainly, but what is the point of the world if there's no Russia? It's like this very, very self-centered way of seeing the world. And so the whole idea about strategic empathy is that you need to practice it. You need to practice putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And what we're trying to do with the NUTRI data set that we're building is to create a baseline that enables you to do that more easily, that enables you to see how this other country sees this question, because it is a question that's obviously being discussed more and more. Publicly and internationally. So, moving on to the question of what's new about NUTRI. How is this different from what already exists out there? So, the first thing I'd say is that what's already out there is very high quality. So in this slide, I mean no slight on any of the other excellent work that's being done. I mean, massive respect to the work that CIPRI does, to the work that the Federation of American Scientists, CNS, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, they all do fantastic work. What we're trying to do is not to compete with those people, but to provide another source of data that complements what they do to broaden our perspective on all of these issues. So what you find if you look at those types of sources that I've named is that they're often quite dense, they're complex, they contain a lot of nerdy words and concepts, a lot of facts and figures, all kind of put together. Sometimes they're behind a paywall, not always, but if you want like the full-length CIPRI yearbook, you have to pay for that. And there's generally a focus specifically on the composition of arsenals, which is to say how many warheads, how many bombers, how many missiles, what type of missile, exactly where are they, etc., etc., etc. Now, that's great from a technical side, and if you're just interested in nuclear strategy, that's really fascinating. But it does immediately also bring into play the politics of open source intelligence, right? Which is like, where did the data come from? Is it trustworthy? Has it been verified? If it has been verified, who verified it? All of these questions. And it leads to, for example, to take a kind of a common example from recent times, the Federation of American Scientists finds ICBM fields in Chinese deserts, and the Chinese say, oh, that's like wind turbines, and we're building wind turbines or something like this, right? So China's immediately denying the intel, whether that's a credible response from China is, I'm not going to give a position on that, but what I would say is like that type of politics is immediately, it immediately politicizes the whole discussion. Now, I'm not saying that these discussions aren't political, they always are inherently political, but what we're trying to do is acknowledge that that is one useful conversation that's happening and do something alongside that that complements it, which is to talk about the official policy of these official policies of these states as they present them themselves. So the perspectives and policies of the nuclear armed states in their own words. So instead of that complex body of data using open source intelligence, what we're going to do is we're going to build a simple interactive website. And I must say, I've just seen a first draft of this from our web designers. It's pretty exciting to see that coming into shape. It's going to be interactive and public, free to all. And the idea is that, as I've just sort of explained, we focus only on official disclosures based on official sources, official statements from government departments or leaders of these countries, etc. And the idea is that rather than having it in a long form textual format, we've hired an individual expert for each of the 9 nuclear armed states that have done the research, and they've compiled the data themselves. They will then present that data in a kind of a more neatly formatted way that gives you short summaries on each of these policy areas around transparency. So the idea is that the data still has the same credibility and the same depth to it, but it is formatted and abbreviated so that you can quickly look up the specific, an answer to the specific question that you want to ask. And then also that the website will give you the ability to quickly and easily compare across countries or across policy areas around transparency. So I'll say a little bit more in a couple of slides on the actual framework for what that's going to look like, but that's basically the idea behind it. In fact, I'll just jump ahead to that now, and yeah, so research framework and method. So the kind of overarching question that we are answering with NUTRI is, do the nuclear armed states choose to disclose information about their nuclear arsenals and related policies and facilities? Why or why not? So, are they disclosing information? Yes, no. If they are disclosing information, do they tell us why they're disclosing it? If they're not disclosing information, do they tell us why they're not disclosing it? So, an example, if you think of the 2021 integrated review that the United Kingdom published, they announced an increase in the warhead cap overall, and they also announced that they would no longer be disclosing numbers around their arsenals. And in that document, they gave a very, very brief explanation for why that was. It was like something along the lines of, due to the changing international strategic environment, or something like this, right? So it's not a lot, but it's something. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and also document that type of statement. Like if they're changing their behavior around transparency, what do they tell us about why they're changing their behavior? So what we've done is we've defined 24 categories. And an example of one category is nuclear warhead numbers. So how many nuclear warheads does this country have? And the question derived from that category is, does this country, whether it's China, Israel, France, Russia, whoever, does this country disclose their total numbers of nuclear warheads, yes or no? So on one level, you can use the NUTRI website just to get a simple yes-no, and you can compare all of the countries at that really foundational level. But then also for each category, you'll get a longer form 300-word summary that says, the United States discloses its warhead numbers historically in a couple of different contexts. Here's one of them. It's the New START Treaty. They disclose these numbers to Russia in these ways for these reasons. And then another category example would be doctrine on the employment of nuclear weapons. So that's the battlefield use of nuclear weapons. Again, the question that NUTRI is asking is, does country X disclose when it will consider the employment of nuclear weapons? Yes or no? And so an answer, if you apply that to China, would be yes. China absolutely does disclose that. It says very clearly, every chance that it gets, that it has a no first use policy, and that no first use policy is unconditional. It will never be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. Again, what NUTRI is not doing is making any judgments about whether or not that is accurate or believable. All we're doing is we're reporting the facts as these states report them. And the idea, again, is to, linking back to that idea of strategic empathy, is that we think that there's a lot more dialogue needs to happen, but the point is that if you're looking to build collaborative, trusting relationships over the long term, a good way to start dialogue is not by accusing your adversary of lying or being, malicious. It's you start with the facts as each country presents them, and then hopefully build on that. And then a final category example might be AI integration. So there's a question in the NUTRI framework that says, does this nuclear armed state disclose the ways in which artificial intelligence has been integrated into its nuclear weapons systems broadly? So it's not about command and control specifically, it's about all of the different places where AI might touch the development and maintenance of nuclear weapon systems. So I've defined those 24 categories. For each of these, our national experts, who are these external experts that we've hired to do the research, are going to go to the documents of that nation and draw out of all of those documents answers to every one of these categories. So you can go to the NUTRI website when it launches, which I didn't actually say yet, did I? But NUTRI is due to launch February, March 2026. So 3 or 4 months' time, this will be live and you can access this resource. You can go to the NUTRI website and very quickly get simple, clear, but well-researched data on these 24 areas related to transparency. And, I would say, without hesitation, some of these experts are the leading experts in the world on these issues. So it's really high quality data. We've also had a mix of kind of next generation or kind of newer generation experts as well. So we've got a really good mix of expertise doing this work. And then finally, for each country, NUTRI will present one national summary. So this is like a blog post length, maybe 750 words, that just gives a general introduction to how this country thinks about transparency. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it indifferent? Does it practice transparency generally? Does it not? If not, why not? So for each country, you'll have answers to the 24 categories, and then you'll also have one national summary telling you generally how they think about transparency around nuclear arsenals, facilities, and policies. So there's the framework. I'm going to jump back now and just go to this question here around guiding questions. So if you think back to what I said earlier about the idea of transparency as dialogue, if transparency is dialogue, then the ways in which you engage in transparency determine the types of message that you're trying to send. And so as a result, one of the ways that we've conceptualized both the categories that I've just talked to you about, the transparency categories and the overall national summary, is in responding to these questions. So if data is disclosed by a nuclear armed state, who is it actually that does the disclosure? Is it the president in a speech? In the case of France, where with each new incoming president, there's this tradition that they get up and they give a big fancy speech and they lay out their vision of French nuclear deterrence practices and what those practices are intended to do and in what contexts. Or is it more of a technical thing? Is it that, you go to the United States and the weapons labs produce these very dense technical reports that they then give to their Russian counterparts? What type of data do they disclose? Again, going back to the UK example, the UK will tell us the warhead cap on their arsenal. So they'll tell us the maximum number of warheads, but they won't actually tell us the number of warheads. So what's the distinction there? Why are they willing to disclose the maximum number, but not willing to disclose the actual number? It's kind of nerdy nuance there, but there's something in that. So another question is, when or how often do they disclose it? So, America, I should say the United States, has disclosed its total warhead holdings occasionally, but not regularly. And I think, there's perhaps a concern that they don't want to be seen to be doing that too regularly, or it starts to build up an expectation that they will do that regularly. Again, where do they publish the data? Is it on the Foreign Ministry website, or is it in a closed briefing to their adversaries on the basis of a bilateral treaty? These are all important questions in terms of thinking through what is the state trying to say by disclosing this information, and what can we learn about how it thinks about transparency by engaging with these questions. And then finally, just at the bottom there, again, this again just comes back to this question of mutual understanding or strategic empathy. Is like, why do they disclose data or not disclose it? And so all of these other questions, the who, what, when, where, how, they all feed into this broader question of we're trying to understand what it is the state thinks, thinking like a state. So what is it that the leaders of this state think about transparency? How does it impact their national security? How does it impact what they see as a strategic balance or deterrence relationship? And as a result, why do they do what they do? So there's a whole bunch about what NUTRI is, what it's intended to do, and the outline of the way that we've actually structured it. Excuse me. So I'm not sure, I think I'm just about done here. And so what I thought I'd do finally is just throw out a few questions that you guys might like to consider. So how do you personally think about transparency? Is it something that's discussed in your national context? Is it something you discussed in your group work with the EVN? Also thinking about recent developments in military strategic affairs. The US and Israel bombed Iranian nuclear facilities recently. How do you think that affects the way that Russians and Chinese think about transparency? Those facilities have been under inspections for quite a long time. We've been building databases over time at the IAEA of like what's there, what's not there, how much of it is there, all of these things. And then, well, the United States pops up and bombs them. How does that affect the way that other countries think about transparency? And then finally, can you think of any specific transparency initiatives or initiatives related to this topic, current initiatives that you think are interesting or useful? So just some food for thought there as I wrap up. And I would say thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Lyndon. That was brilliant, really informative. I can see we have one question in the chat, so let's start with that from Javed Alam. If external fact-checking isn't part of the model's workflow, where does the burden of validation fall? For researchers who rely on transparent and verifiable methodology, could you elaborate on the specific mechanisms within your system that establish credibility and ensure the integrity of the generated outputs, especially under the first two guiding questions you referred to?
Sure thing. Thank you for the question, Javed. It's a really good one. So I think what I would say in response to this is it's useful to step back and just remind people about what NUTRI is and what we're trying to do. So we're not trying to fact check the statements of nuclear armed states. That's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is build a shared foundation of data on what states say they're doing, and then on the basis of that, to try and support further research and encourage dialogue. So in terms of in terms of your question, how do you establish credibility and ensure the integrity of the outputs generated? So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, we have hired some of the best researchers in the world who work on these issues, who really know what they're talking about. However, it is also true that we've then bounded their work by saying we only want you to rely on official government disclosures. So they, as expert as they are, they're also bound to only report what the governments report. That data is being independently peer reviewed, so all of the data then goes through a blind peer review process also. And then, yeah, I guess what I would say is that what we will try to do over time is highlight official policies, official statements, official practices, and then where people like yourself and others are interested, also point to external sources where other people have done the fact-checking work. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we acknowledge that there is a wealth of excellent work already done in this space by many different organizations, that we sometimes collaborate with. And for what it's worth, those people are world leading in those. I gave the example of the Chinese missile fields. Matt Corder and his colleagues, the Federation of American Scientists, just do fantastic work, right? So we wouldn't try to compete with them. What we're trying to do is complement them by saying, you have this open source data set, we have this official policies data set. At the boundary between those two things, there's probably some really interesting conversations to be had. And we believe that we need to have more of those conversations precisely because nuclear risks are rising. There's a lot of shouting at each other at the United Nations. There's a lot of talking past each other. There's not much actual constructive dialogue to try and get back to the core shared interest, which is preventing escalation, preventing miscommunication and accidents that could lead to unintended escalation to nuclear war. And so that's how we see this contributing to that. I hope that answers your question, Javed. Thank you.
I had a couple of questions as no one else is stepping forward. Actually, Lyndon, do you mind turning off your screen sharing so that we can see more of you and less of the screen?
Sure thing.
I wanted to ask whether there's any trends visible from the data that you've seen coming through so far, like either points of commonality in terms of states' perspectives on this stuff or practices, or points of divergence.
Yeah. I guess what I would say to that is there's nothing immediately surprising. There are some countries that like transparency and like to talk about transparency, and there are some countries that don't like transparency and don't like to talk about transparency. So yeah, as I say, I'm not sure that anyone that watches this space would be greatly surprised by that. However, what I would say is it does also, to me, that observation does just reinforce the fact that I don't think it's useful to just always assume that more transparency is better. I think that there is a tendency in general, for lack of a better word, Western discourse to just assume that that's the case, especially when it applies to our adversaries. But then, if you look at French or UK policies, sometimes there are areas where they like to call for greater transparency, but they're not super excited about revealing all of their state secrets either. So I think what I would say is that even though and I'm kind of talking around your question, Dave, even though I don't have anything exciting to tell you from the data so far, what I would say is that it does reinforce my general belief, which is that we need a more nuanced conversation about the value of transparency, and we need to think about contexts in which it can and cannot potentially help to, reduce the likelihood of nuclear weapons use.
Thanks. That's really interesting. And yeah, like in our conversations together, and I hope some people have got a flavour of this from the masterclass today, it has really been interesting to me to challenge my immediate recourse to thinking, transparency good, and actually having a bit more of a nuanced take. On the UK, you mentioned the warhead cap, which I have criticised a fair amount in my previous work, the reduction in it. And I won't go into the ins and outs of that here because I'd be just stealing the floor from everyone else. But one of the things that's quite interesting about that is that UK's doctrinally, because they're doing stockpile stewardship, they are actually assembling and disassembling warheads, all the time. And so the actual number fluctuates. And were they to pick a target number, they might actually have to pick one higher than their actual holdings in order to account for the fact that it's going up and down at a particular time. So that, there are some nuances here. That's their position anyway, not offering a defense of it, just an example. Anyway, enough from me. Saima Amansail, you have your hand up. Please ask a question.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting discussion, and it got me thinking about how people like us living in regions that have geographical contiguity and also recurrent crises have this mutual distrust amongst ourselves. Just as an example, I can tell you that in 1992, India and Pakistan undertook an agreement which was bilateral in nature, in which India stated that it doesn't have chemical weapons, and hence, we had this agreement, and later on in 96, it joined as a possessor state, and the stocks, when the stocks that it had were as much that dismantlement took till 2010 for them. So that kind of the implication that I'm trying to draw here is that the significance of transparency is there. Now I have two small one query, and I want to frame it in a fashion that you asked about what existing measures are already there. I kept on thinking about NTI because its index on nuclear security is something which is very interesting, because it incentivizes takes the states to take further steps. So and this is one part of my question. So would this kind of data that you are sharing on your website, would it have kind of implications that the state would feel more incentive in order for them to be more transparent, or is it just data? Because I feel that it's never data. And as a researcher from the global south, I have sometimes been interacting with the epistemic communities of the. I have had this problem of facing the issue of how we are framed. So there are good proliferators and there are bad proliferators. There are fastest nuclear arsenals. So would there be implications of this sort that the data would then talk about? This is one of my concerns that I wanted to talk about, because nuclear policy making is something that will always have a tinge of transparency in itself is something good, but then from whose perspective are we talking about? So I don't know if I've made myself clear, but I had these questions that came up to my mind, and I thought I should use this platform to maybe Lyndon, you can talk about them. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much for the question, and I certainly acknowledge the concern around the ways that common discourse frames certain states. With regard to your question about the nuclear threat initiative, the security index, I would just flag that what we're trying to do with NUTRI is quite different to that. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is technical, and there's many reasons for that, but the two that I'd flag, one is technical and one is political. On the technical front, there are very clearly specific things that you can do to make your nuclear installations more secure. It's not just guns, guards, and gates. It's all kinds of protocols around when those guns, guards, and gates are implemented or put into practice, who has responsibility for what, where information is shared. Like, there are these things that over time, based on the development of best practice in industry and also in military affairs, there are things that we have a pretty good data set to say these things definitively increase the security of this type of facility. And so what NTI has done with that index is they've taken some really fantastically talented researchers, and they've gone out and they've sought out all of that data, and they've compiled it and said, if country X has this type of facility, and if they implement this type of security measure, and ideally, and I don't know it intimately enough to know, but ideally that security measure is also context specific and takes into account the local culture, local norms, etc., then we can assume that the security of this facility will be increased. And in that regard, what they've done is they have created, ranking countries, and they've actually scored the countries who's better at doing this stuff, who's not. And I'm aware that there's been some discussion around how that has actually, as you say, it's incentivized those countries to actually, quote, do better at nuclear security. That's quite a different context to what we're doing with NUTRI, precisely because if I were to start ranking countries and going, this country is, quote, better at nuclear transparency, then immediately the implication is the more transparent you are, the better. And what you don't catch in that is all of the massive nuances of nuclear strategy, of nuclear posturing, of different doctrinal choices that different countries are making. And all of those choices are so historically contingent. They depend on when this country built their weapons, you know, what type of weapons they've deployed, where those weapons are stored, what their policies are for the use of those weapons, and all of those things each create their own set of conditions that mean transparency might or might not increase the security around those weapons or decrease the likelihood of those weapons being used. And then the second thing I would say, that's kind of like, it's a technical and political thing. And then the more political side of that is just, I think it would be a mistake to assume that the West knows what's best in terms of transparency, and therefore we should just adopt that framework. And so just in terms of the naming of the projects, I would emphasize the NTI project is called the Nuclear Security Index because an index is about ranking and scoring. What we're building at BASIC is not an index, it's an inventory. So it's the Nuclear Transparency Inventory, and an inventory is a list of factual information. Again, setting aside Javed's earlier question about verifying the data, it's a factual list of data as published by these countries. So it's kind of a different thing. And then finally, to your question, what I would say is, like, I think it's also good to give credit where credit is due. The 1988 India-Pakistan non-attack agreement is a fantastic example, in my view, of exactly this type of thing, where two countries said, do you know what? The worst thing we could possibly do is start attacking each other's nuclear facilities. So let's just declare that we're not going to. And let's every year, I think it's like the 1st of January or something, it's like, but once a year on a set day, they make a declaration about where they have nuclear facilities, and they both collectively recommit to this idea that they will not attack each other's nuclear facilities. I think the whole world should be adopting this India-Pakistani protocol. I think it's fantastic. And so, credit to India and Pakistan for that. I wish more people would do the same thing.
Thank you very much. We've got a few more questions. I hope we can fit all or most of them in. A couple of contributions here from Sarah Al-Sayed. Firstly, providing the example of the CTBT's international monitoring system and international data center disseminating to all states and sub-state actors upon request the fused and analyzed data from IMS is an excellent transparency initiative and attempt at leveling the global playing field. And she also has a question: what, in your view, is obscured about transparency, capacity, appetite, and motives by the 24 categories in the database fields and doesn't necessarily appear in the national summary? Maybe this is a question about what you want users of the tool to be wary of when drawing claims.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And for anyone else on the call who's not aware, Sarah does fantastic work around verification, so I can highly recommend that you check out her publications. It's on the IMS, the CTBT IMS, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that there is a question at the moment, given the reduced funding for multilateral endeavors due to US ending of funding in certain areas, that there's sort of an open question around whether that will impact the work of the CTBTO generally. What I would love to see is greater, what's been noted, and this is something Sarah has written about, citizen science. Like, how might the CTBT international monitoring system be integrated into more collaborative dialogue and partnership with societally generated information that can help us to verify certain things? I think that's a really interesting question. On the specific question about what the 24 categories might obscure, the 24 categories or the national summary might obscure in the data, is a really good question. To be clear, the intention with NUTRI is that it's, if you like, a bit of a living database, in the sense that the hope is, if we can continue this over time, we'll do future iterations of the NUTRI database. And the idea is that we won't take data away, we'll just keep adding data to the database so that you can compare future years against the current year. But equally, there is a goal to expand what it covers. So in future, hopefully it won't be just 24 categories. There might be more categories, but that's a long-term goal. In terms of how I've tried to address that concern at the moment in the design of the NUTRI database is I kind of take the assumption that there will be some things that some states want to talk about more than others and some things that they won't, and vice versa, some things that other states will want to talk about more and some things that they won't. And so what I've tried to do is, and you know, you'll only be able to see this once we actually publish the site. I've tried to balance these categories politically, which is to say, some of the categories the United States will want to talk about, great. So we've included that category. Other things China or Russia might want to talk about more, okay, so we've tried to include those categories as well. I don't think that I'm ever going to be able to balance all of those things, but that's kind of like one of the ways I've tried to get at your question in advance, Sarah. The broader question still stands, though. I think the same as with Javed's question, where Javed was saying, like, how do we verify this data? It's like, it's also worth approaching the database, or the inventory, I should say, with a critical eye to say, like, what's missing in the gaps between these categories? You know, are there other areas of policy that are perhaps as relevant or more relevant to the overall operation of this country's nuclear posture that we're not seeing here? It's possible. And so I can only encourage people to approach the data critically, which I think is always important.
Thanks very much. We have a question from Safia Mansour. How should the concept of transparency be reconceptualized in contemporary nuclear politics, where deliberate strategic ambiguity remains a central element of deterrence theory and state practice?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Safia. I think what I would say to that is, how should it be reconceptualized? I believe it should be conceptualized as a potential practice among other practices, not as the answer to the problem of strategic stability. Already, strategic stability obviously is problematic in various ways in terms of coherence of the concept, and then whether or not that particular understanding of strategic stability is shared amongst different actors. So that's a challenge that we face anyway. What I would say is that as far as NUTRI is concerned, what I would encourage in terms of conceptualizing the concept of transparency is that it is a practice that states can choose or not in order to communicate things or not, but it's not the answer. Precisely because every state has a different strategic culture and a different nuclear posture that derives from that. And if we actually want to get to the basis of mutually respectful dialogue in the direction of collective efforts to reduce the likelihood of nuclear war, we probably need to start from a perspective of not just assuming that our perspective is correct, whether that's pro or anti-transparency, but instead listening, deep listening. And so I'm not sure that I exactly answered your question, I'm sorry, but that's what I would say about how I think about transparency.
Thanks very much. There were a couple of hands up that have since come down. Afsar Kazi, if you wanted to ask a question, there is time now. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for Lyndon and Dave and all the team from BASIC for organizing this session and for giving us insights about this NUTRI. Seems like a very interesting project. And I actually wanted to give a comment on one of the questions listed in the last screen, That was about, that asks, what are your views about the political and security value of transparency? So I wanted to comment on that because I think the initiatives such as NUTRI, they do matter, because I see transparency as a behavior. And I think as a student of international politics and international security, I think how states behave with each other is not only about what states say to each other, but it is largely about what they know about the other state's reputation for resolve, like how resolved the other state is in regards to a certain goal that they commit to. So I think once you have things like nuclear transparent inventory, that would lead to an understanding of what kind of a resolve a state has towards ensuring nuclear transparency and nuclear non-proliferation and curtailing proliferation. So that might lead to a better understanding of the other states' reputation. And I also see a better transparency contributing towards promoting better strategic empathy between states or the nuclear counterparts. So that is the comment I wanted to make regarding the political and security value of transparency. And I think that this is a great initiative by BASIC in an effort to build a nuclear transparency inventory.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. There is one, I know you were very short on time, Dave. There is one more question there from Sarah that looked interesting.
If you feel like you can answer it in a short time, please do. Yes, I was aware that was the one we hadn't come to.
Yeah, sure. So Sarah asks, what's your top line observation about the distinctions between nuclear and AI integration transparency, especially in view of the general purpose and diffuse nature of AI? So AI is a massively complex area to try to verify because, for a start, with LLMs, we don't even know why they're outputting the particular outputs they're outputting. They just are as input, output, and then wiggle the dials and the output changes. So even on that level, it's complicated. On the question of nuclear and AI integration, my personal perspective is that there is so much room already for misunderstanding and misinterpretation in the nuclear realm that AI is kind of like multiplying that scope for misunderstanding / misinterpretation. So I guess what we're trying to do with NUTRI at the most foundational level is just start the conversation. Again, going back to the very start of this presentation, just to say, let's just try and set a baseline and go, okay, here's the baseline. This is where we are right now. This is what all of these countries say about their practices around nuclear weapons. And let's try to insert into that an expectation that they say something about AI. Whether the thing that they choose to say about AI is, we don't talk about AI, or whether they actually say something more constructive or productive, which would be my preference, but that's only a personal preference. I think it's just a conversation that we desperately need to have. And so what we're trying to do with NUTRI here is just by adding that as one of the categories is to encourage conversation in that direction so that we can set some baselines. Because at the moment, all we have is a bilateral statement from China and the US. And apart from that, it's, anyone's guess what's going on. But I'll leave it there, and thanks very much all for your time and attention. This has been great.
So much. Okay, well, that was great. I'll draw this masterclass to a close now. Thank you so much to everybody for your contributions, but of course, very particular thanks to Lyndon for giving up his time and for a fascinating talk and fielding all of the questions. As with all of our masterclasses, the recording of this will be posted online in due course. So if you know somebody who would be interested but wasn't able to attend in person, please do share that with them when it goes up. And hope to see you all soon in the next one. Take care and have a good day. Bye-bye.